This is BreakPoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Well, welcome to BreakPoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. And Warren, one of the challenges that we face is that we record our conversations for BreakPoint This Week about the news of the week on late in the week. But something could happen on, say, Friday that just, takes everything to a whole new place in terms of the cultural conversation. We talked about mass shootings, and that conversation continues because of what happened in El Paso and what happened in Dayton, Ohio over the weekend. And this past Wednesday on our podcast, we featured a conversation that I had with our BreakPoint colleague Shane Morris about a lot of these issues, but it's still the thing kind of front and center on everybody's mind. And I think first we want to say that our hearts and our prayers go out to a whole lot of hurting people in the aftermath of the shootings last weekend. I think there's been something about these. One of the things that Shane and I talked about is whether our fear is misplaced, whether the 24-hour news cycle makes this more of a challenge than it is. But I think there are a whole lot of people afraid. And even the week rounded out with a man detained at a Walmart in Missouri and a shooter on the loose in Houston. And, we're just at that point where I think people are on edge. And so there's a whole lot of concern specifically for the victims. But it seems like there's something about these events that not only lead us to pray for the families, but kind of make us think, wait a minute, is this a new chapter for America?
Yeah, I think that's right. And, I think that's actually, John, one of the ways that Christians can add some value to this conversation. One of the most common, maybe I've heard it said the most common admonition in Scripture is fear not, do not be afraid. And I think you're right that there's a lot of fear in this country. And while I don't think we should denigrate or diminish the concern, the compassion, and even the passion around these issues and questions and coming up with great solutions, I do think that we ought to, provide hope, that Christians ought to, be in a place with their families, with their friends, with their relatives, where they can speak words of hope, speak words of peace into those situations without in any way diminishing the magnitude or the seriousness of this situation. And in some ways, it's a gut check for the Christian community. If we are not in a place where we can do that, where we have relationships that will allow these words of hope and comfort and peace to be heard, maybe we ought to take a look at those relationships. But I do think you're right. I think the last week or 10 days, maybe we've turned a corner. We hear people like David French, a staunch conservative, an Iraq war veteran, talking about red flag laws, and even President Trump has come out and said that he would take a look at red flag laws. So I think that the conversation is shifting a bit.
Yeah, I think it is. The troubling thing for me is when you hear crowds chant, as happened, I think, to the president in both El Paso and in Dayton, especially in Dayton, do something, do something, do something. And look, first of all, I think that reveals two things. Number one is a lot of people don't know what to do. I mean, do what? What laws will work? And I do think that we have to consider public policy in a new kind of era that was off the table before. But at the same time, gun control for gun control's sake is not the answer. And so we've got to figure out what that something is. And when you reach a point in a culture where you're demanding that something be done, but you don't know what that something is, that can lead to some really unintended and negative consequences. So that's the first thing that I think we need to realize. And then the second thing is that the demands are going to the government to do something, as if all problems are political and all solutions are political. And you can kind of see, is something that Chuck Colson pointed to a lot. We've talked a lot about BreakPoint, called the political illusion, the idea that it is the government's job to fix everything. That's a really dangerous place to be. In fact, we made the case on BreakPoint this past week, on specifically Tuesday and Wednesday, that these are problems, that what this is revealing about us are things that the government itself can't solve. Doesn't mean the government has no role. I don't hold that view, but at the same time, the government can't fix what is broken in America right now, that these shootings, in my mind, are revealing about us.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I especially appreciated, John, some of the commentary that you've put out this week about young men, and and the crisis of fatherlessness in our country, and the need to. As you said, if we're going to look at public policy solutions, maybe we ought to look at public policy solutions that support marriage, that support intact families. It's not to say that maybe there aren't things that we can do related to the gun issue, but yeah, the unintended consequences that could come from a knee-jerk reaction related to gun control really concern me, and I hope we don't go in that direction. And I don't think we will. For one thing, Congress is not in session right now.
Right.
During the month of August. So, there's an old joke that, Congress is not in session. Your freedoms are safe for another day. And I think that I'm not trying to be glib or facile about this, but I do think that applies here. I mean, we do have a little bit of a cooling off period, at least in the public conversation, because Congress is not in session, maybe to think this through and to come up with some bipartisan solutions.
So the point of young men, I think, is particularly concerning for me, and that's what we talked about on Wednesday. Really, what I wanted to do this week is make two main points. Number one is that we look back at failing civilizations in history, and we study it in history as if the Roman Empire was there on Tuesday and it was gone on Wednesday, which is not. I mean, the collapse of the Roman Empire, as Edward Gibbon and other people have kind of traced. I mean, this is hundreds and hundreds of years. And you have these indicators of a failing society that Alexander Solzhenitsyn talked about. And he specifically said the decadence of art and the lack of great statesmen, both of whom I think we could point to today and say that's a good indication of where we're at. But the question that I had is, look, there does seem to be an uptick in this kind of cultural chaos. That doesn't mean you're less safe than before or anything like that. I mean, I think there were some interesting articles that you're probably more afraid than you need to be as an individual because of there's a whole lot of ways in which the world is safer than ever before.
That's right.
At the same time, when you have this sort of chaos, right, which is I always look back, and this is going to be a dumb illustration, but I always look back at the first Batman movie that I watched with Jack Nicholson, and I thought, that guy's evil. Wow. And I was, junior high at the time, and I'm watching Jack Nicholson, just kind of a level of sarcasm and glibness about the violence that he was doing. But he was doing it to be rich, right? He was doing it to win. And then you go to Heath Ledger's Joker character in the Batman, and suddenly you realize, oh, Jack Nicholson didn't even touch the evil for evil's sake, evil for chaos's sake. And then you look at what Shane and I talked about this past week on the podcast, that there's two ways that we have seen these shooters go. First of all, what they have in common is that they're all men. What most of them have in common is that they're young men. What most of them have in common is that they had some childhood trauma, most often the loss of a father figure in their life. And where do they go? One segment goes to ideological extremism. You certainly have Islamic extremism, but you also have white supremacy. You have other kinds of that sort of extremism. On the other hand, you have a nihilism, chaos, anger, just revenge. I think the Las Vegas shooter, which we still don't know hardly anything about, fits into that category. Certainly Dylan Klebold, as opposed to Dylan Roof, right? Dylan Roof was a racist in Mother Emanuel Church. Dylan Klebold from Columbine, or the Sandy Hook shooter, Adam Lanza. These are guys that have kind of gone into chaos. And you think, what kind of culture produces young men that go to one extreme or the other? And look, that's an ideological extremism or a nihilism that you see across the spectrum of young men today, whether they become mass shooters. In other words, that's the root. It may not bear that level of awful, awful, evil fruit, but that's the question that I think we really needed to ask and really push is, look, we've been talking for years. The breakdown of the family matters. The lack of dads matter. Young men are playing, getting distracted in video games. They're becoming perpetual adolescents. They're more prone to, suicidal thoughts and, distraction and perversion and addictions than ever before. This is in that category, right, of evil. And this is something, by the way, that I think the church has a specific answer for that nobody else in culture does. And this is something you can't legislate away.
Well said, John. You're listening to BreakPoint This Week. I'm Warren Smith with John Stonestreet. We'll be back in a minute.
We invite you to visit breakpoint.org, While you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of great books and other resources. And you can link up to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Well, we're back on BreakPoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. To catch the different commentaries and especially the podcast conversation that I had with Shane Morris this past week, come to breakpoint.org, click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. Warren, one of the things that I think that we're being asked to face, and here's the challenge, I think. The El Paso shooter clearly was motivated by a level of ideological extremism, white supremacy. Now, this week, Tucker Carlson on Fox News said that if you added up all the white supremacists, they could all fit inside a college stadium, so therefore it wasn't something to be really concerned about. I think that if you added them all up, you probably could fit them in a college stadium, but I'm not sure why that equals it's not something that we should be concerned about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, without interrupting you too much here, John, I mean, I think Tucker Carlson's comments were fabulously misguided. And by the way, a college stadium that holds 60 or 70,000 people, like you said, that is something to be worried about.
Well, I remember the conversations we would have about Islam and say we're only 10% are radical, but if you do the math, that's an awful lot of people.
Yeah, 10% of a billion people, right? A billion is, Muslims around the country. And also, too, I've heard it said, John, on the other side of that scale, that at the height of the civil rights movement, which was an amazing culture-changing era in this country, that at the height of the civil rights movement, there were only between 50 and 70,000 people that were actively involved. I mean, obviously there were marches on Washington where 250,000 or 500,000 or more would show up, but in terms of active involvement, it's really in the tens of thousands. I mean, culture change happens with a relatively few number of deeply committed people. What is it that Bill Brown says? That I would rather have one committed person rather than 1,000 interested people, I think is something close to what
yeah, and
it's
true of the LGBT movement, clearly.
That's
right?
exactly
In other words,
right.
culture change happens that way. And I want to ask you about another story that came out this week, and I'm going to make a connection that many people might seem strange, but I think it's absolutely direct. And so we talked in the first segment specifically about the failure of our culture to cultivate and catechize and create citizens out of young men, that we've got a real young man problem, and we're failing them. And it's not because we're too hard on young men. Don't get me wrong. I think it's because we've given young men a vision of the world that's utterly meaningless. And so that's why so many in millennials and Gen Zers say they can't find meaning and purpose. And when you can't find meaning and purpose, then you're drawn to ideological extremism. The other thing is that we've lost the institutions of civil society, what Chuck Colson called the little platoons, what Edmund Burke called the mediating institutions, that between the government, and this is why it's not a government problem that a government solution can bring, but between the big government and individual citizens, in eras where there was just as much access to guns as ours, maybe even more, maybe not quite, obviously different kinds of weapons and so on, but you had basically institutions that created a pathway for young men to be mentored into what it means to be a man. And those are gone. At the same time, we were talking about that this week, Warren, story in the Washington Post saying that the Boy Scouts pedophile case, as many know, there's been tons of reports of sexual abuse in the Boy Scouts of America. It may exceed that of the Catholic Church when it's all said and done. You have had a long history of connection with the Boy Scouts, now deeply connected with Trail Life USA, which is a kind of an attempt to replace that. Look, in a culture that doesn't have strong mediating institutions, that doesn't have strong families, where the Boy Scouts have been enormously important, what happens if the Boy Scouts go away? This perpetuates the problem we were talking about in the first segment.
Well, I would say what happens if the Boy Scouts as it existed 50 years ago goes away, that's a tragedy for American culture. If the Boy Scouts as it exists today goes away and is replaced by an organization like Trail Life USA,
God bless us.
I say thank God for that.
That's actually a fix.
So it's but it does, highlight what you said and what I just said, highlight a couple of things that are worth mentioning. Number one is that the Boy Scouts throughout most of the 20th century was one of those mediating institutions. There are 100 million men and boys that participated in the scouting movement during the 20th century. That is a significant number. And when an organization like that goes away, That leaves, as you and I sometimes say, John, about the church, whenever it withdraws from culture, a giant sucking sound. Now, I don't want to conflate the Boy Scouts with the church. They're not. It's not the same thing, but I do think it'll create a giant sucking sound, which is why I'm really grateful that Trail Life USA is moving into that void. 30,000 men and boys that are now active in Trail Life USA, in an organization that's only 5 or 6 years old. So it's growing dramatically and attempting to fill that void with specifically Christ-centered values. It's not just sort of a generic belief in God, but a specific belief in the God of the Bible and of Christ. So that's one thing. Number two, though, is this pedophile scandal that's plaguing the Scouts now. Really does pose an existential threat to the Boy Scouts. In terms of it being as big as the Catholic Church scandal, I don't know the answer to that because I don't think we have all the data about that yet. But I think it is as big or even bigger in this way, and that is that it could truly bring down the Boy Scouts of America. The Scouts are already in difficult financial, in a tough financial condition right now. They've got tremendous debt because of a facility that they've built in West Virginia called the Bechdel Summit, and then these cases, especially a case that the one that you refer to that was announced this week in Pennsylvania, is it's going to open the discovery process in that case is going to open up a lot of documents that had previously been sealed, and the Scouts are actively considering bankruptcy right now. They've announced that themselves. So yeah, this is a huge deal for the Boy Scouts. It's a huge deal for America. I think for those of us that care about the men and boys, that we should be following this case, and we should be supporting alternatives to the Scouts like Trail Life USA.
Yeah, I think I agree completely. I'm thankful for the group of Christians willing to step into the gap on that one. And I think when I said earlier that this is a problem that only the church can solve, what I meant was you scan across the cultural landscape, you look at people call them the 7 mountains or the 7 spheres or the 7 arenas, and you look and you see, okay, where are we going to find men, and especially the formation of men in any of these areas? We're not seeing it in Hollywood. We're not seeing it in the state. It can actually accomplish that. Education is where it should be happening, one of the areas it should be happening, and it's not. So who could actually help? And I think the church is the group that can, and because we can help families and we can help dads, and Christian men can step in like Trail Life USA has done into families without dads. And I think that we have to take seriously. You've heard us talk about this on BreakPoint a ton of times, that God determines the exact times we live in the boundaries of our dwelling place, as Paul says to the Athenians in Acts 17. And if this is our moment and this is our time, and we ask the question, what good can we promote? What evil can we stop? What's missing that we can add? You know what's missing that we can add? Men. And I think that's going to be part of our cultural calling in the days ahead. Well, you're listening to BreakPoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
You can learn more about BreakPoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
Well, we're back on BreakPoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. Come to breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org. Click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to some of the articles and resources that we've mentioned on today's conversation. And also, if you did not know, one of the things you can catch on our website and never miss is our daily 3.5-minute commentary on the culture called BreakPoint. If you remember Chuck Colson's voice on Christian radio, this is Chuck Colson with BreakPoint. Well, BreakPoint continues in that aim of helping Christians think clearly about what's happening in culture from a Christian worldview. And some of the stories that we're talking about today are things that we tackled this past week on BreakPoint. And you can sign up to get that in your email box, or you can go to our podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe and never miss a BreakPoint commentary. Another story, Warren, that I wanted to talk about this week, and I got to be honest, I think I can count on one hand, on one finger, the number of times we've referred to A.C. Slater from Saved by the Bell on any BreakPoint program. But here we are. Yeah. Mario Lopez has made a pretty decent career out of being kind of a commentator on pop culture since his days on Saved by the Bell. I grew up on Saved by the Bell. You're too old for that,
yeah,
right?
I didn't watch it, but I know what it is, and I know who he is.
That's what the kids are watching these days.
That's right.
Well, anyway, he was on Candace Owens' podcast, I think, which, by the way, is enough to get you
blacklisted. Blacklisted, like the Red Scare back in the day.
Yeah, it kind of is. But there was a conversation happening around parents, and I remember this because we actually talked about it. There was a A-list Hollywood actress who basically said that her child was transgender because as a 3-year-old he said, "No, I'm a girl." I think that's the way it went. I don't remember which gender direction it went. And the conversation between Candace Owens and Mario Lopez, he kind of said something. I think that first of all, 5 years ago would have been unremarkable. Definitely 10 years ago, but I think even 5 years ago, which is if you're 3 years old and you're saying you're feeling a certain way, or you think you're a boy or girl, whatever the case may be, I think it's dangerous as a parent to make that determination then. Now, that's specifically what he said when you're 3 years old. Not when you're 9 years old, not even when you're 14 or 16, but when you're 3 years old. Now, I think, look, teenagers are so unclear about their identity that if they say something that misaligns with biological or physical realities, which is what we would say, for example, in the case of an eating disorder, that it's dangerous to believe someone, right, when they're denying physical reality. 3-year-olds do this all the time. Like my little boy, now he's only 2, so maybe in a year he'll be a little bit clearer, but my 2-year-old is convinced that he's Batman, right? Like he has the suit, he loves it. He's fascinated with superheroes. He goes and punches the imaginary bad guys. It's a lot of fun to watch. But I don't cater to these fantasies beyond a certain point. But Mario Lopez got in a lot of trouble for this.
Well, he sure did get into a lot of trouble. And it's like you said, John, something, if he'd said it 5 years ago, it would be unremarkable. And but even taking the LGBTQ issue out of it for a moment, is there anything that we let a 3-year-old decide for him or herself? We don't let them drive a car. We don't let them decide what college they're going to go to. We don't even really let them decide
what they eat.
What they eat for dinner. Exactly right. And yet, for Mario Lopez to say that we shouldn't let a 3-year-old decide his or her own sexuality, I mean, you're right. It shouldn't be. That seems like a perfectly reasonable and rational conversation or thing to say. And it's just, again, amazing how the ideology trumps reality in this conversation. And you're right. It ignited such a firestorm that he ultimately issued something of an apology for the.
It was a pretty strong apology, and that bothered me as well. Look, he said it's dangerous as a parent to make that determination then. If you look at his comment, he was not speaking beyond 3 years old. And for him to, at some point, I don't want to go back to the whole conversation on young men, but one of the things we need men to do is to not apologize when they catch a firestorm.
That's right. Well, especially when they do something right.
No, it's a sign of both. It's a sign of masculinity to apologize when you did something wrong.
That's right.
But not because you catch a lot of heat on something observably true.
Absolutely right. I think that's a really key distinction is that, I think being a real man does mean apologizing from time to time when you mess up,
Absolutely.
when you do something wrong. But it also, like you say, it means standing strong. Whenever there is, whenever you do something that's right and true and good, but people don't like it, then you need to have the courage of your convictions. And it was troubling on a kind of every level, but it is also a sign of the times. It's a sign of our culture these days that these kinds of things are happening time after time after time. That the social media, the radical left, ideologues, they're just on the lookout for that kind of stuff. They're remember a couple of years ago, John, we were talking about Tim Gill, this gay activist, and now that they had won the Obergefell, I think you used to use this in one of your speeches. After he'd won the Obergefell decision, somebody asked him, "What do we do now?" And then he said, "We roam the countryside and shoot the wounded," or something like that.
Yeah, you're conflating two articles, but he did say we punish the wicked.
Punish the wicked. That was what it was. Yeah, and I think that that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing. Absolutely. Well, look, we're almost out of time. I would love to talk about the Babylon Bee for a number of reasons. First of all, the Babylon Bee shares my spiritual gift of sarcasm, and I think that's really fantastic. And there's a really interesting thing happening where the fact-checking site Snopes, which has really been a helpful place for a long time, but then basically became politically loaded, started fact-checking clear, observable satire. My favorite is they literally fact-checked the Babylon Bee headline, which was CNN has a laundry machine to spin the news or something like that, and they fact-checked that. And then, of course, this was a great one. Georgia lawmaker claims Chick-fil-A employee told her to go back to her country. Later clarifies he said, "My pleasure." which is so hilarious. And there's so many great ones of the Babylon Bee. But there's a fascinating thing happening now as we're trying to deal with our kind of culture of fake news and the difference between objective truth and ideological spin, which I think we've lost on all kinds of level, and then the loss of a sense of humor. But we're out of time to really dive deep onto that. The ongoing battle. Plus, we'll probably know more next week between what happens between the Babylon Bee and Snopes. So maybe we can come back to that next week. You've been listening to BreakPoint this week. Thanks for joining us each and every week as we talk about what's happening in the culture from a Christian worldview. Subscribe to our podcast. And if you have a minute, review our podcast. That helps us get the word out about how to communicate a Christian worldview about what's happening in culture. And we do that each and every day at the Colson Center through the BreakPoint commentaries and the BreakPoint This Week conversation. Again, go to breakpoint.org to subscribe or to find the articles that we talked about on today's program. For Warren Smith, I'm John Stonestreet. Thanks for joining us.